The evening began like any other. Mason was just 3 months old. We were at my parents' house because they insisted they hadn't had enough bonding time and wanted a family dinner. They poured rosé as if it were a celebration, expecting me to feel grateful that my baby was even getting their attention. My brother Alex had recently gone viral with a local dance video, and the house looked like a festival in his honor. Glittering balloons hung everywhere, and an elaborate cheese board sat proudly on the table. Mom kept calling him the family's shining star. Dad kept topping off his glass before he even finished it. I cradled Mason against my chest, uneasy. His breathing seemed off, quicker, tighter, each inhale seemingly harder than the last. I tried to mention it at the table, cautiously. "I think Mason's having trouble breathing. We might need to leave soon after dinner," I said. Mom rolled her eyes with exaggerated disdain, as if inconvenience were an allergy. "He's just a baby. Babies cry, babies fuss. You overreact to everything," she said, swirling her wine and waving me away, eager to return to praising Alex's Instagram comments. Dad lifted his phone triumphantly. "Look, 24K likes," he said. "That's real pressure. Your baby whining isn't an emergency." Mason's cheeks flushed near his temples. He whimpered, a sound that wasn't mere discomfort. It was pain. His tiny fists clenched, as though he was struggling against something inside him. "I need to leave," I said, standing immediately. "Right now." Dad stepped in front of me, arms stretched like a blockade. "You're not ruining this night for attention," he said in that low, controlled voice he always used to try to dominate me. "Sit down. You make everything miserable." Alex chuckled quietly. "She acts like that baby's a ticking bomb," he muttered. I moved toward the hallway anyway, holding Mason close. His body was growing hotter, too hot, and his breaths came shallow and uneven. He let out another weak cry. Mom snapped, annoyed. "Oh my God, will you stop? Sit down. Have some wine. Alex hasn't even opened his gift. You can deal with your theatrics after dessert." "I'm not waiting," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. Mason was in distress. Dad grabbed the rocking chair by the hole and shoved it in front of me. "Leave now, and don't expect us to take you seriously ever again. We will not reward this manipulation." My chest thudded violently. Mason emitted a sharp, desperate cry, like his airway was closing. I turned to the kitchen with my free hand, reaching for my keys, but they weren't there. Mom had taken them. She lifted her glass slowly, sipping without looking at me. "You lose everything because you panic," she said. "Clean the counter, maybe look better next time." She wanted control. She always did. I held Mason closer, feeling his body stiffen, trapped in something invisible, yet terrifying. "Give me my keys," I whispered. She didn't even glance at me. "If you ruin Alex's night again, don't bother coming back here." Alex raised his glass. "Cheers to boundaries," he said. They laughed and clinked their glasses. Mason's breathing accelerated, his tiny lips trembling, as though he was running out of energy. My panic began to harden into a cold, hollow realization. This wasn't just favoritism or dysfunctional parenting. They had chosen celebration over urgency, as if my child's struggle for air was nothing more than an inconvenience. I brushed past the rocking chair, nudging it aside with my hip, while keeping Mason pressed against me, and headed straight for the front door, barefoot, trembling, but certain. I didn't pause. I didn't argue. I didn't waste a single breath explaining. Dad's voice thundered behind me. "If you walk out now, don't expect us to indulge your hysteria again." Mom shouted after him. "We're done with your drama." And Alex, ever the audience's favorite, added, "This is exactly why no one wants to deal with you." I didn't even bother closing the door. I ran, barefoot down the pathway, Mason in my arms, holding him as if the entire world had narrowed to just his heartbeat and mine. Because it had, my hands trembled as I tried to open the ride app. It took me 3 tries to hit the right button. While I was still shaking, my mother's text appeared on the screen. "If you rack up a massive hospital bill, don't expect help from us." I turned the phone face down and buried it in the diaper bag. Mason's soft whimpers had become rapid, shallow breaths. His eyelids drooped, not from sleep, but exhaustion. I held his tiny cheek with my free hand through the entire ride, whispering his name again and again, begging him quietly to stay with me. In the ER waiting area, I clutched him close until the triage nurses rushed him away for oxygen. I stood frozen as they worked, my shirt damp with sweat and tears. Each passing minute, waiting for results, made the walls feel tighter, like the air itself was collapsing around me. They diagnosed him with acute respiratory distress from a sudden infection spike. The words barely registered, only that he needed immediate intervention. While doctors stabilized him, I stood outside the treatment room under harsh fluorescent lights, barefoot, hair tangled, mascara streaked. I felt nothing sentimental in that moment. What I felt was sharp, clean, final clarity. They hadn't ignored him because they didn't understand danger. They ignored him because it didn't involve their golden child. I never texted them, never called, never sent an update. They didn't deserve to know a single detail. Hours later, Mason finally stabilized. I stood there in that too bright corridor, my arms aching from hours of fear, and realized something permanent. This wasn't just single motherhood. This was survival. That night, they had forced me to choose between their comfort and my child's life. And I chose him. That was the birth of a version of me that would never again beg for validation. When Mason's eyes fluttered open and his tiny fingers wrapped around mine, I made a silent promise. Never again would they get near him. Not physically, not emotionally, not ever. I never went back to their house. Not once. I didn't send a message. I didn't justify. I didn't create another scene for them to twist. I simply vanished from their world. And silence, true silence, cuts deeper into narcissists than any scream ever could. For 2 full weeks they didn't notice. They didn't reach out. They assumed I was sulking and would crawl back. As always, Mom's social media proved otherwise. Posts from wine nights, brunch photos with Alex, captions about protecting your peace from negative people. They weren't addressing me. They were ridiculing the very idea of my existence. Meanwhile, I was spending half my nights sleeping on a hospital cot because Mason needed 2 more rounds of treatment, steroids and breathing support. The nurses printed instructional guides for me. The doctors repeated explanations until I memorized every symptom, every sign. I learned how to gently press his chest when he wheezed, how to keep his head elevated while he slept. I learned how to be his entire safety net because I finally understood no one else ever would be. Then, one night around 2:30 a.m., I sat watching him sleep beside his oxygen machine. His breathing was steadier, his small chest rising and falling with fragile rhythm. And suddenly, old memories flooded back. The times I convinced myself my parents' neglect was normal. I remembered waiting outside choir practice for hours, forgotten again because Alex had soccer. I remembered Mom's cold voice saying, "You don't need anyone celebrating you. You're not that special." And I realized I had been trained since childhood to accept abandonment as ordinary love. I remembered Dad once telling me not to seek help because girls like me didn't deserve easy paths. In that instant, everything clicked. That night at their house wasn't an isolated act of cruelty. They had been training me, my entire life, to accept that I was disposable. And I made a quiet promise. Mason would never, ever feel expendable. Not for a moment, not even in passing. 3 weeks later, once Mason was stable enough to come home full-time, my phone buzzed with a text from my parents. "Why aren't you calling?" As if the world had flipped upside down. They had somehow heard through the neighborhood that I'd been at the hospital, but not a single word about Mason's condition. They didn't ask if he was okay. They didn't even check on him. They only wanted an explanation for why I hadn't updated them. I read it, closed it, and didn't respond. Soon after, the calls started. Accusations of overreaction, claims that I was punishing them, that I was destroying family bonds over something trivial and misunderstood. I muted my phone and fed Mason his bottle, watching his tiny eyes follow the sunlight slicing through the cheap blinds in our apartment. Their barrage continued. Voice messages after midnight, long paragraphs, guilt, anger, victim playing, silent treatment. And while their cycle of chaos spun on, I quietly rebuilt myself in corners of my life they didn't even know existed. I switched Mason's care to a pediatric clinic closer to home for his follow-ups. I joined a support group for parents of medically sensitive infants. I learned which foods could trigger issues, how to monitor his breathing with my eyes closed, how to anticipate subtle signs before they became emergencies. I found remote work, sacrificing some pay for safety, presence, and stability. Every action I took wasn't revenge. It was intentional separation, not dramatic, not theatrical, just methodical distance. Inside me, something shifted. I realized I no longer had to give them the power to claim they had ever supported me or my child. Sooner or later, life would demand something from them, and I knew the type of people they were. Health, money, reputation, they would falter. And when they called, expecting the same desperate daughter who would cave out of loyalty, I would be gone. I wasn't that person anymore. Weeks turned into months. Mason grew stronger. I learned to breathe without waiting for their approval. My silence became a shield, unyielding, impenetrable. Nearly a year later, out of the blue, my brother texted, "Mom's sick. Really sick. Dad can't handle it alone. Answer your phone. We need you." Mason was napping beside me, and I stared at the notification. For the first time, I didn't tremble. I didn't reply that day. I didn't reply the next. Mason didn't need to shoulder their chaos. He only needed a home where love wasn't conditional, where it couldn't be bargained for. Alex stopped sending paragraphs eventually, shrinking his messages to a single line. "Dad says, if you don't help now, you'll regret it forever." I sat in the city park, Mason playing freely in the sandbox with two children he had just met. I read the message once and deleted it. Regret was their language. I no longer spoke it. I closed the phone, tucked it away, and sat fully present, noticing the world around me instead of scanning it for danger. Mason looked up, waving. "Mom, look, I made a tunnel." His smile radiated independence. Slowly, I rose and walked toward him. Finally, a woman who had arrived in her own life. Weeks later, the hospital mailed a routine notice to update emergency contact information for all family members. I crossed out their names without hesitation and wrote one simple sentence in the box. No living family contacts. Not tragic, not dramatic, not emotional, just the factual truth. As I sealed the envelope and dropped it in the outgoing bin, it hit me. Revenge wasn't about payback. Revenge was showing them a life that thrived perfectly fine without their presence. It was letting them watch, finally realizing they had never been at the center of anything but their own illusions. I stepped into the warm sunlight, holding Mason's hand. We crossed the street toward the grocery store. Cars passed, people laughed. Life carried on as if they had never been part of it, and they never would be again.